We are thankful that you all were able to hop on for this update. I want to introduce our two speakers who most of you probably know well. First, we'll hear from Heather Johnston, who is the founder and CEO of USIEA. And then we will hear from Ari Sacher, who is our senior policy advisor and also the chief systems engineer of Iron Dome, the funniest rocket scientist you'll ever meet. And he will be bringing a report live from the ground in Israel. So in just a minute, I'll hand it off to Heather. But what I want to say to everyone that's tuning in is we will have a time at the end for questions. So if you want to put questions in the chat box as Heather and Ari are speaking, please feel free to do that. And then I'll be filtering through those questions and we'll do a Q&A at the end. So please do feel free to participate and add in your questions as we go. So with that, I will turn it over to Heather.
Great. So good to be with all of you. And thank you so much for joining us today. And I know that many of you are following the events taking place in and around Israel and the Middle East and this unfolding war. I want to thank you very, very much from the bottom of our hearts, from our staff and board, for the incredible involvement that you have had with USIEA over these last years, and the care and the concern that you've taken for the U.S.-Israel collaboration. And as you know, Israel is in the Middle East sort of as the last and only democracy, and the one that is really in the most real sense carrying forward the American interests for the world and for that part of the world. And it is a rough neighborhood, as you can see. And so just by way of update, as Ari is going to give kind of the larger perspective on kind of from the ground there. And my hats are off to him, as he has had 4 children in this war, not on the outside of the war, but in the war. And it has been an incredible circumstance for him to be living through that hell of your children not knowing how they're going to be doing in the next 24 hours. So a lot of respect for Ari and what he and Tova have gone through over these months. I think that what I want to contribute today is just that while we have a war that has intensified, a situation in Gaza that has intensified with this ceasefire being on and then it's off, and then hostages coming back and looking emaciated and like they've been in the Holocaust, and the horrific monsters called Hamas that are psychopaths. You can imagine what it's like trying to do a deal with the devil, and how deceptive it is, and how one thing is said and then it's not true, and the whole situation is so difficult. And so the Israeli government is in that extreme place that they were, at the beginning of the state of Israel, when you're trying to really hold on to your nation. They are in no less situations of intelligence and having to deal with these players in the Gaza Strip that are like the orcs of Middle Earth. If you've ever watched the Lord of the Rings, the orcs of Middle Earth come up from the ground, from the pit, and they're like demonic figures, and it has been really, really tough. And so my hats are off to the Prime Minister of Israel, the War Cabinet, and I know many of you are praying for them, and I want you to continue to do that they will have the wisdom and the treasure trove of wisdom from God to handle this demonic entity. I think the large picture, and we must be able to connect the dots of the whole picture, the overall strategy, and the challenges that are interconnected today. And that would include Gaza and Lebanon, and the idea of normalizing with Saudi Arabia, which could be around the corner, dealing with Iran and their will to succeed and to dominate with regional power and proxy networks. These are all intertwined, interconnected, and one affects the other. So you can't just have a war in Gaza and just focus in on Hamas when you've also got raids taking place inside of Judea and Samaria, dealing with the Hamas stronghold there. You've got the Houthi rebels that are a major player in this war. You've still got Hezbollah in the north. And so we've got quite a situation that is very regional in its comprehension. And so that grave misconception that the Iranian regime is now weak is really a falsehood. And we're dealing with that nation as the stronghold and literally the network that they hold in the Middle East. And so there is a run for power, for dominance, for deterrence in the Middle East today. There's some good guys, and then there's some bad guys, and then there's sort of some in-between guys. And I believe Ari's going to touch on that today. But as we go into the future, I think that we need to understand that as President Trump has been elected as our commander-in-chief out of the United States, that we do have a new day in the U.S.-Israel collaborations. We've been able to see the much-needed munitions and bombs and things that Israel has needed for months and months, held up by the Biden administration, has now been released, and that largesse is headed to Israel. Thank goodness, not just for the Gaza war, but for the deterrence and the war that may come with Iran. And so here we are standing with a new day, a new president who has condemned UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, has removed us from out of the UN Human Rights Council, who has taken active steps to remove the sanctions off the settlers in the West Bank. There is a litany of things that within the first 2 weeks that Donald Trump did to reverse course with the state of Israel. And I want to just say we need to thank God for that. Those watchmen on the wall need to understand the times that we're living in. Donald Trump came in with a very exotic vision just recently to build the Riviera of the Middle East. That is, try to think St. Croix, St. Bart's, the Westin Hotel on the Gaza Strip. Think surfing and sand instead of Hamas tunnels. It sounds so crazy, and yet it is not so crazy to think in terms of being able to actually move 2 million people. It's been done a lot. There's 7 million Syrians living in Turkey today. There's a lot of displacement around the world at times, and that could very easily happen. And Donald Trump's vision, after having built part of New York City, is not so far flung to scrape the Gaza Strip of its demolition and the buildings that have completely collapsed. There's no housing there for anybody. And to allure the Sunni Arab nations into some economic development for the future, to rebuild Gaza. So these are some of the things that are on the table, and they sound kind of crazy, but aren't we ready? Aren't we ready for some out of the box ideas, some ways of thinking that sort of jar us out of this stalemate and difficulty and get us to think on a higher level? Well, I want to just introduce my really good friend, Ari Sacher, and thank you, Ari, for the incredible role that you've played in the building up of Israel's missile defense systems. That ability to defend the nation of Israel at the local level, on the borders and around the cities, and then at the mid-range level, and then the supersonic intercontinental ballistic missile defense systems, the drones, the incredible emerging technology of Israel. All of this Ari has been a part of, and not to mention has a heart like nobody for the state of Israel. So Ari, welcome. Thank you.
Very much, Heather. I want to talk today about, give you an update, a snapshot of what's going on and what may very well happen or not, because the uncertainty here is incredible. So let me just give you a quick snapshot where we are now. The Gaza war, the Swords of Iron, has been going on since October the 7th. We had a horrible start. But after that start, Israel has taken control of the fighting. We have severely weakened Hamas. We've decapitated its military and political leadership. We've destroyed most of its arsenal of rockets, as well as their capability to build more. And this is critical. Whatever is in Gaza is all that there is. They're not smuggling in more, and they're not building anymore. We took out all these missile factories. Nah. Ceasefire agreement brokered by Egypt and Qatar, and most importantly, the U.S., was brokered on the end of January last month. It takes place in 3 phases. So in the first phase, Hamas would release 33 Israelis, mostly women and children, in exchange for Israel releasing 30 to 50 Palestinians for every Israeli released. That number is actually higher. During the first phase, Israel would have to allow sufficient quantities of humanitarian aid, and there is really no definition of the word sufficient. Leaving that up to interpretation is highly problematic, because that's what allowed Hamas to say, wait a minute, we're not getting what you promised, when Israel said, yes, you are. So it would also allow displaced Palestinians to return to their homes, and it would start a phased withdrawal from Gaza. This has happened. Israel at one time was owned and operated the Netzarim corridor, which went right through the middle of Gaza. No one could go over from either side. Fortunately, most people were on the south, because we had cleared out the north in order to take over Gaza, which is what we were doing when we were rudely interrupted by a ceasefire. So we have pulled troops out. Gazans are flowing to the north as they wish. There's not a lot in the north now. It's pretty much dust and flood water, and it's really not a place that you want to live. And I believe President Trump has mentioned that multiple times. That's the first stage. In the second stage, Israel is meant to accept a permanent ceasefire, and then Hamas will release the remaining living male hostages, both civilians and soldiers, for an exchange of Palestinian prisoners. What they want is an all for all. You release all of our Israeli hostages, and we will release all of the Palestinians that are in jail in Israel. And there are thousands. And these people have committed the most horrific crimes: murder, torture, terrorism. That's the direction that we are heading. Now, Hamas has so far released 21 hostages, and all of these hostages were alive. The last 3, as you had to have seen, were emaciated. They were sickly. They had been kept in impossible conditions. They hadn't seen the light of day since October the 7th. They were tortured. They were starved nearly to death. They spent a lot of time, and they're still spending time in the hospital since they were released over a week ago. But at least they were alive. There is a suspicion that the next hostages will be in even worse shape. The idea is that Hamas would send out the best ones first, so that they would get a chance to have their time in the limelight. There's also suspicion that some of the Israelis scheduled for release in the first phase are dead, specifically the Bibas family. Their father, mother, and 2 children were taken into captivity. The father was released last week, and the mother and the 2 children, you've seen them all over the place. The young redhead Kfir, who celebrated his first birthday in Gaza, if they haven't been released before the father was released, the chances of them being released in the future alive are very, very slim. And everybody in Israel is waiting for them to come out. And if they do come out in boxes, then the tide of public opinion will turn. Because right now, the tide of public opinion in Israel is staunchly for doing everything we can to get out as many hostages as we can. Okay, now the current status. Hamas announced a couple of days ago that they will not free the next 3 hostages on Saturday. It's coming Saturday, it's planned, because they accuse Israel of being in breach of the agreement. How so? Well, you're not giving us sufficient humanitarian aid. Define humanitarian aid, we asked. They said no. The U.S. and Israel responded with an unequivocal threat to rain, quote, the fires of hell on Gaza if all the hostages are not released by Saturday at noon. And here's where things get ambivalent. What does all of the hostages mean? The term is vague, and I suggest perhaps it's purposely so. I've seen 3 different interpretations. One, it could mean that all of the remaining hostages, to the last hostage, those that are meant to be released live and dead until the end of the 3rd phase, would be released. It could be all of the hostages that are scheduled to be released as part of phase 1, which means another 12. Or it could mean just the 3 hostages that are scheduled for release on Saturday, the hostages that Hamas is now taking a step back and saying maybe we won't release them. The reason that that term could have been purposely left to interpretation is to facilitate negotiations, to let the sides capitulate without actually capitulating. It lets the sides take a step back, and I think this is something that the president is certainly behind. Earlier today, Hamas said that an agreement had been reached, but not sure exactly what had been agreed upon. I've heard reports that it was signed, that it was not signed, that Israel doesn't even know about it, that Israel doesn't agree with it. Be that as it may, Israel is preparing for war. We have canceled, IDF has canceled leave for all of the soldiers that are based on the Gazan border, tens of thousands of them, and it is calling up a brigade of 15,000 soldiers for emergency reserve duty. The son of Iran Glosser from JH Israel, who leads JH Israel, was recently called up, sent down. We are preparing for the worst. Hamas is also flexing its muscles. A couple of hours ago, they fired a rocket at Israel. They still have rockets left. We shouldn't consider otherwise. They have rockets left, not a lot, but they have. That rocket was fired. It fell short. It did not land in Israel. It landed in Gaza, and it killed an 11-year-old Gazan child. And minutes later, the IDF bombed that rocket launcher to smithereens. They are messing with the wrong people. So we're going to do a lot of nail biting until Saturday. Probably things will not be resolved until the very last minute, which is typically the way things work with Hamas. Indeed, the ceasefire wasn't signed until the last minute, but Hamas has every reason to keep the ceasefire alive. If Israel renews attacks, then they will eventually destroy Hamas the same way that the U.S. destroyed the fascist regimes in Nazi Germany and Tojo's Japan after World War II. Even more than that, Hamas can give up people. They don't care if their people live or if their people die, and they'll hide behind civilians, using them as shields. But what Hamas cannot handle is losing territory. According to Shiite and indeed other Muslim, Sunni to a certain extent, dogma, land that has been captured by Muslims must never be relinquished. And if Israel goes ahead and takes that land or takes a buffer zone on the Israel border in the north, in the east, patrols the Philadelphia corridor in the south that separates Gaza from Egypt, from the Sinai Desert, then Hamas will spur a sea change in the way Hamas sees things. So if we do indeed go to war, what will that look like? So I can guarantee you that Israel will use overwhelming force that it has not used until now because of the full support that it is getting from the current administration in the U.S., militarily and diplomatically. With the beginning of the war, Israel had been receiving from the U.S. under the Biden administration a whole bunch of weapons. We were receiving bombs. We were receiving weapons that will allow us to project our force. We were receiving missile defense, Iron Domes that are partially built in the U.S., Arrow 3 missiles that are partially built in the U.S. We were getting everything we needed, but there was a quid pro quo. I'll tell you something. Last week, someone asked me a question. They asked, is Israel getting everything it needs from the U.S. in order to defend itself? And the answer to that question is sort of, or at least the answer was sort of. The U.S. has given Israel offensive and defensive weapons. The offensive weapons are large caliber bombs. Some of them are precision guided, called JDAMs and SDBs. They're used to take out buildings in which rocket launchers are stored, buildings in which the Hezbollah leadership was meeting. Indeed, it was a U.S. weapon that took out Hassan Nasrallah, who was being buried on February the 23rd. Surprisingly, I was not invited. The U.S. also provides D9 bulldozers. A D9 bulldozer is the mother of all bulldozers. It is used ubiquitously in construction sites around the world. Israel and other countries around the world have militarized it. They have put a reactive armor on it to make sure that if anybody tries playing with it, they're going to have a very, very difficult time. Israel uses the D9 to clear area, to clear buildings that are housing, especially in Lebanon and in northern Gaza, buildings that were housing arm caches, buildings that were housing terrorists, buildings from which snipers were shooting on the IDF. It tore them down. Sometime during the middle of the war, July-ish, the flow of offensive weaponry slowed. In certain cases, it slowed to a trickle. As far as the D9 was concerned, a vehicle critical to our projection of force, the flow stopped completely. And there were certain quid pro quos that Israel was expected to follow through on. We were expected to not go into Khan Yunis, where Hamas leadership was, because that would lead to too many civilians. We were supposed to not go into Rafah, because that was where on the Egyptian border, a place that we needed to go in order to prevent smuggling in of more arms from Gaza, and also to go into Lebanon. You guys can't go into Lebanon. That might have a certain effect. It wasn't anything explicit. It was that implicitly the Biden administration was encouraging Israel to do what the Biden administration wanted it to do, to defend itself, but not to win the war. That has changed with the Trump administration. Indeed, not only did the Trump administration release thousands, 7.4 billions worth of JDAMs, of Mark 84 2,000-pound bombs, of Hellfire missiles launched from helicopters, but they have also released 100 D9s for immediate transport to Israel. And when the president was asked why, he said, well, they paid for it, and we did. And the United States is now helping Israel not only to defend ourselves, but to lead the war, to project power. And I always compare missile defense to a knight in a shining suit of armor. Imagine you have a knight and he meets a genie, and the genie says, because I love you so much, I'm going to give you a suit of armor that is made not of iron, of steel. I'm going to give you one that's made of titanium. You haven't heard of it? Trust me, it's really, really strong. And under the titanium, I'm going to put bulletproof Kevlar. You will not be hit in battle. You will not be harmed in battle because you have this amazing suit of armor. That knight may not be harmed. He might be defended, but he will not win. He will not be victorious, emerge victorious against his opponent unless he has a really lethal sword. And that's what Israel needs. We need the suit of armor, and we need the sword. And things have been changing now. The weapons are now on their way, and Israel has their fingers on the trigger. And I can tell you this much, if we go in, we are not going to come out until we have emerged victorious. And until then, we wait. Give it back to you, Joan Leslie.
That was really excellent, Ari. Thank you. We've gotten a couple of questions that have come in. And just as a reminder to everyone, please do feel free to submit questions right now while we have Ari. One question I want to ask you is about Egypt. So Egypt is saying that Israel might be in violation of the peace treaty and they are amassing troops in the Sinai. So do you see this as a real risk? Because since October 7th, 2023, Israel's been in a 7-front war, but not on the Egyptian front. So where does that stand right now?
Was indeed all quiet on the Western Front in Egypt. There is saber rattling going on in Egypt, and I think there are two reasons. Reason number one: Egypt wants hegemony in the Middle East. They want to be the people that are playing the radio. They don't want to dance along to someone else's tune. They brokered the peace agreement along with Qatar. These are two countries that are explicitly and even implicitly antagonistic to the state of Israel. How they became brokers, honest brokers, as you will, I have no idea. Egypt, I don't know if they're amassing troops or not. There is a agreement between Israel and Egypt that if they amass troops in the Sinai, they will be in abrogation, in breach of the peace treaty. We allow them to have a certain amount of troops. So again, we have this fluid amassing. What does that mean exactly? I don't know. Egypt's biggest problem is that President Trump has pretty much directed Egypt and Jordan to accept a large number of Gazans. He wants to clear out Gaza before there really is nowhere to live in Gaza today. Keeping people in there. If you were to open the floodgates, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Gazans would leave on their own volition. Um, but Egypt has been asked to settle Gazans in northern Sinai. Jordanians have been asked to settle in Jordan. The problem with Jordan is already 75 to 80% Palestinian. They don't want any more Palestinians. Egypt, Al Sisi, the president, is in after the country kicked out the Muslim Brotherhood with Mohammed Morsi a number of years ago, almost a decade ago. Egypt doesn't want to go down that path, and they feel like the United States is forcing them, and they're pushing back. That's another wait and see. We got a lot of wait and sees here, which really makes me nervous.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting point, Ari, because I think a lot of us have allowed ourselves to think down that path of, okay, what would this look like for the Gazans to go into Egypt? And doesn't that make the most sense at this point? But I was speaking with a Trump administration appointee last week, and he spoke to exactly what you just said, which is that Egypt and Jordan are both in extremely fragile situations themselves. So their leaders cannot afford to have radicalized Hamas members come into their societies because their countries might collapse. And that would create an even broader Middle East issue than what we have right now. So what would you say to that?
I would say that Jordan is much more fragile than Egypt. The King Abdullah is really in a Hashemite minority, a very small minority. If there is a Palestinian uprising in that country, I believe Israel will support the Jordanians in quelling it. But I believe that if the Hashemites fall, then we will find Iranians once again on our borders. And there
Right.
is no wall between Israel and Jordan. We're going to protect ourselves again with walls all around the country. I don't know why, because they did so well on October the 7th. Egypt is another kettle of fish. Egypt, there is a long border with Israel, and it's in the Negev desert. We will see when Egypt brings in large convoys of tanks. I think Egypt has more to lose than they have to gain. They are the largest, above Israel, the largest recipient of U.S. military aid. And I don't think they want to reverse and go back to the way it was before 77, when they were essentially a vassal state of Russia. I don't think they want to go to China, because China will give you an embrace of the bear. They'll hold you so close you'll stop breathing. I think they want to remain with the Americans, and I think they will come to some sort of understanding with the Americans.
Mhm. That's helpful. I want to go back to something that you alluded to, which was if the Bebas children and mother do not come out of Gaza alive, we could see a shift in public opinion, is what you said. And so I'd just like to tease that out a little bit more. If you could expound on that, what do you think would happen in that scenario? How would it change the trajectory of the ceasefire and the war?
The only reason Israel signed the ceasefire agreement, is because there was the public opinion is split in half in Israel. About half the public said, "Got to stop the war, have to release the hostages at all costs." When I hear anything at all costs, I'm a bit suspicious. The other half of the country said that if you do not continue the war in Gaza, you will receive the hostages back, some alive, some dead, and you will essentially go back to October the 6th. And would have mean that everything that we did was for naught. We would be inviting another October the 7th, and another one, and another one. Um, because the country is split in half, the government has to walk a tightrope. Mr. Netanyahu has a very, very difficult choice to make. I know that Mr. Spock said in Star Trek 3 that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. But on October the 6th, we were on the verge of civil war in Israel, and I don't think that anybody wants to go down that path. This war has bound us together. We have seen the enemy, and it is not us. Um, so I believe that if the Bebas family does come out dead, then that will sway a lot of the public opinion. It'll make Mr. Netanyahu's job a lot easier. His decision, if he decides to go back into Gaza, it will make it that much easier. Until now, Hamas is playing Israel. When Hamas says, "Will we release the hostages? Will we not?" I don't know. Call me back on Thursday. I mean, that just sets the country on fire. It sets Israeli against Israeli. Hamas knows that, and Hamas is so far being very successful at it. We're not good at that sort of thing. We
Right.
don't wait very well.
Right. And when you refer to Israel being on the brink of civil war on October 6th, you're referring to the judicial reform issues.
Among other things, there was judicial reform. There was there was the fights between the religious and the anti-religious on Yom Kippur, the most solemn day of the year. There was a prayer service held outside. And in Jewish prayer services, men and women don't sit together. And they received a court injunction that the men and women have to sit together because some people on the anti-religious side pushed it through the court. And these people said, we don't roll that way. So they had separate seating. And the people came, gladly sat separately. If you don't like it, don't come. And they were attacked, and there were pictures of fighting and yelling and screaming and people hitting each other on the most solemn day of the year. Yeah, we were well and truly on the verge of civil war.
Terrible.
It's hard to think back. That feels like another lifetime ago. On that note, how is the government's coalition holding up right now? What does that look like? Is it at risk of falling apart? Because if the country has been united, I think it's pretty easy to see that the government is not quite united. Can you explain that?
Yes, Israel's government is made up of coalitions. It's led by the Likud, which has the largest number of seats. But this coalition is made up of the Likud, of other right-wing parties, and I hesitate to call them far-right parties, but they are right-wing parties, and the ultra-Orthodox. There's a number of problems going on in Israel. Not only are the far-right parties, see, I said it, urging Mr. Netanyahu to go back into Gaza, but Israel has a problem now that we need more soldiers. There are 10,000 soldiers that have been injured. There are 800 soldiers that have been killed since October the 7th only in Gaza, and there's a large number of potential soldiers in the ultra-Orthodox neighborhoods that have received government approval not to be drafted. It was an agreement made long ago, and there are a lot of people trying to force that. And there is a law now that will force these people to be drafted. And the ultra-Orthodox parties are saying that if you go through with that law, then we're going to leave the government. I think the government is fragile, but there are enough people on the other side of the fence that if the government falls apart for something that is either because the ultra-Orthodox pull out or because the right pulls out, then I think that people like Mr. Gantz would join again. Maybe the Mr. Lapid's party, doubtful, but I think that Mr. Netanyahu will have a majority for the near future. I don't think that this government is going to last the full 4.5-year term that it was meant to last.
Right, right.
Well, that's excellent, Ari. With that, I'd love to just give both Heather and Ari a moment for a closing statement. So Heather, is there anything else that you would like to say?
Yeah, well, just don't ever underestimate Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. And he has had 9 lives in politics, and he is sort of the gray-haired general, commander-in-chief over the state of Israel right now and for the foreseeable future. Needs a lot of support. For those of you that pray for that man. He's gone through a lot. He's had a surgery recently. Most of you may not know that, and has had an infection that has gone on for weeks. He's in the middle of a trial every day, and he's also having to run a war. So be praying for them, for the war cabinet. I think they've called the inquiry that they were going to do on the war, the commission that they had called, we're going to start on Sunday, has been pushed down the road at least 3 months. And so we'll see how that goes. We'll keep our eyes on that. I think that my final and close is just for us to keep in mind that as we go into the future, the U.S. administration, the U.S. Congress is going to have a very holistic view of the Middle East. We're going to have to treat the Iranian threat, the nuclear threat, not just that, but how do we build and coalesce a big, huge defense wall around the drones and the activity, the strategy, kind of an air defense strategy against Iran? How are we going to incorporate a Saudi Arabia coming into the Abraham Accords? And where is that going to stand? Where does Qatar stand, who is vying for dominance in the region over and above Saudi Arabia? Where are all these things going to go? We need security cooperation in the Red Sea. And then just the deployment of troops on Jordan's border against Syria. So there's a lot to consider here as we're looking at the day after war, or not even just the day after, as we're going forward. And the Trump administration is going to have to think about a very large picture. I'm so thankful for Ani Elohim, that God is Lord over the circumstances. We get to see from a biblical perspective that he is absolutely sovereign and in control. And he has his eye and his favor on the state of Israel among the nations, to be a light to the nations. So in the midst of this, somehow we're going to see Israel rise and not fall. We're going to see nations coming to them. We're going to see the increasing of the Abraham Accords. All of this we want to have happen in coordination with the United States of America. So thank you for being watchmen on the walls. Thank you for caring, for giving, supporting our efforts on Capitol Hill. We have a lot going on. I'm headed to Israel in 2 weeks from now to meet with some of the ministers of the government on some of our lanes and policy lanes of action, and look forward to giving you a report.
Great. Thank you, Heather. And then Ari, I will turn it over to you. Any last statements?
Yeah, thank you. Just a quick word. I mentioned that we were on the verge of civil war, and October the 7th changed everything. And the bumper sticker that so characterizes this war is a bumper sticker that states in Hebrew, "Biyachad ninatzeach," together we will emerge victorious. And I say that only if we stay together will we emerge victorious. And if we stay together, we will emerge victorious. Thank you.
Amen.
That's excellent, Ari. Thank you guys so much. We want to say thank you to everyone that was able to jump on today, and we will be doing more of these informational briefings as events are unfolding in Israel. So we look forward to all of you joining us again soon. Thank you.